Please be seated. The story of the wise men from the east following a star is a very familiar Christmas story. Yet this story does not happen on Christmas Eve or even Christmas Day. In spite of all the lovely Christmas cards and Hollywood's interpretation of the scriptures, the shepherds and the wise men were not worshiping the Christ child all together in the lowly stable the night the Christ child was born. Yes, the shepherds were there, but the wise men didn't make it on time. Now there is a joke that implies if the wise men had been wise women, they would have stopped and asked for directions. And they would have arrived on time. And so those Christmas cards would be accurate. And the wise women also, it is said, would have brought more practical gifts that Mary could have actually used for her newborn. Instead of the gold, incense, and myrrh. Of course, I disagree with the joke because gold is always good, as any woman will tell you who has a gold card. Platinum is even better. But I digress. Granted, the wise men had a much longer and harder trip to take than the shepherds, who had only to leave Shepherd's Field, which is right outside of Bethlehem, and go into town to find the Christ child. Plus, they were given implicit directions from the angel of God as to exactly where the Christ child was. The wise men, on the other hand, had no angelic directions. They were following a star and some ancient prophecies concerning the birth of a great Judean king. So naturally, they made plans to go where? To Jerusalem, where the present king of the Jews resided. The wise men prepared to meet with King Herod. So they brought with them their finest clothing for a royal visit. Unlike the shepherds, who were comfortable in the humble stable, the wise men were men of great wealth and prestige. A palace was more to their liking than a lowly room of straw and animals. The wise men were accustomed to mingling with the upper crust of society because as astrologers, they were treated as very important people by the aristocracy. And they were highly respected in their field and seen as seers and advisors for royalty. They were learned men who knew the ins and outs of political intrigue, why they could wine and dine with the best of them. A common stable would be the last place these wise men would look to find the newborn king. After all, one does not look for a prince among the cattle and sheep. Princes are born in palaces, surrounded by the best that wealth can offer. And so Jerusalem was their destination to find the new King of the Jews. And the star confirmed their plan as it seemed to rest over this grand city. Upon their arrival to Jerusalem, they immediately started asking where to find the Christ child, saying, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed the star at its rising and have come to pay homage." One may ask, why were they asking these questions? Well, the reason the wise men started asking about the Christ child was because it was evident by the lack of festivities in Jerusalem that no new prince had been born. Where were the parties? Where were the celebrations? The people of Jerusalem were not celebrating a royal birth. All was just going on as usual, as if nothing important had happened. So imagine the concern And most of all, the disappointment after such a long travel, after such a long journey, the wise men must have felt upon their arrival. Well, as they're in the streets asking folks, where is this child? News of the wise men's arrival did not take long to reach the palace walls, because King Herod had ears everywhere. And Matthew writes, when King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. Unfortunately, the wise men had gotten it wrong. Anybody know of any wise men today getting things wrong? Yes, the star appeared to be over Jerusalem, but was actually resting a bit further down the road, just a little further, over the little town of Bethlehem. In fact, it was Bethlehem of Judea, which is about 6 miles south of Jerusalem. And this now bustling town is known as a suburb of Jerusalem. That is how close it is to the remains of King Herod's grand palace. Geographically, the wise men were not off by much, but politically, the result of their miscalculations would prove to be a disaster. Because the wise men assumed that the Christ child would be born in a wealthy palace, their inquiries alerted King Herod to the birth of the Messiah. King Herod was an evil king who killed anyone he feared was trying to take his throne away from him, including members of his own family. Just the mention of the possible birth of the Messiah set his paranoia off. So when King Herod learned from his advisors that the Messiah was to be born in the little town of Bethlehem, not far from the city walls of Jerusalem, he decided to meet secretly with the wise men. Of course, this made the wise men feel even more special. After all, they had been given a private audience by the king of Judea, when in actuality, they were being set up by Herod. Matthew writes, then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. And then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, so that I may also go and pay him homage. When they heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. It is not until the wise men leave behind their miscalculated destination that they can actually see where the star is pointing. It is only after they let go of their previous ideas of where the Messiah was to be born and whom the Messiah truly was that the hearts of the wise men are open to receiving the King of Kings. The scriptures tell us that when they found the Christ child not in a palace, but in the house of a carpenter, they were overwhelmed with joy. It is in the humble dwelling of the Christ child where the wise men have their moment of epiphany. The King of Kings came not to be born within the royal walls of a palace and to be treated as royalty, but to live with the lowly and poor, making him accessible to those who are the least in the world. The greatness of this newborn king went way beyond the riches of this world, for the Son of God came to seek and to save all who have lost their way. And it is on bended knees that the wise men present their gifts to the one who came to give his all that we might have life. The scriptures tell us that the wise men opened their treasure chest and offered the Christ child gifts of great value. The gift of gold for his sovereignty, the gift of frankincense for his priesthood, and finally they presented him with the gift of myrrh for his sacrifice as the Lamb of God. The King of Kings, who came to conquer the world, one heart at a time. The wise men found in the loving arms of the Virgin who had risked her life to give us the Son of God. This is not what they had expected. This is not what they thought they would find after the long journey. No. But it is much, much more. The scriptures tell us that after being warned in a dream, the wise men did not report back to Herod. Instead, they went home a different way. But sadly, the damage had already been done. Their arrival had put the Christ child's life in danger, along with all the male children 2 years and under living in Bethlehem. And as the wise men headed east to return home, Herod's soldiers were sent to Bethlehem to kill the innocent. As the Christ child, along with Mary and Joseph, escaped westward to Egypt. The story of the Epiphany of the wise men causes us to reflect upon our own lives. How many times have we believed we were on the right path, only to find out that we have missed God's best for us because of our own preconceived ideas? How often have we misspoken of God's plans to those who have no understanding? Each one of us has been called to seek the Christ in our lives. And as we seek him, we need to remember that with God, we are always to expect the unexpected. If we seek Christ in the material world, we will be truly disappointed. It is only when we humble ourselves on bended knee that we will find the King of Kings. And once we have found him, the question remains, what are we willing to offer the Christ child from our own treasure chest? Will we give him the treasures that he seeks the most? Our hearts, our lives, our all.